Durst, all counsel are present. I want to get a show of hands. Who really wants to have a transcript in hand as opposed to just looking at the screen? Raise your hand if you need a transcript. One. Anybody else? We're going to cut down the printing costs are enormous. So one person wants a transcript. 2, 3. Okay, we'll make. I saw
4 hands maybe total.
Did you 4 hands? Okay.
Sure.
We'll make 4, and if somebody changes their mind, we'll change it. But next time we'll do. Yeah. So, and one for the court. So, okay, good. Make 6 of them. All right. Now the people may call their next witness.
Bill Mayer, Your Honor.
And the alters are present.
Please raise your right hand to be sworn. Do you solemnly state that the testimony you may give in the cause now pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you, sir. Please be seated. For the record, please state and spell your first and last name.
Bill Mayer, B-I-L-L-M-A-Y-E-R.
Thank you, sir.
And I'll have you scoot forward a little bit and move the microphone towards you both so that you can speak right into the microphone and project your voice. You may adjust the handle if you wish, adjust the microphone, tip it so it's closer to your mouth. That's good. Very well. You may proceed, Mr. Lewin.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Mayer, the woman who just testified, Ruth Mayer, is your ex-wife, is that correct?
That's right.
And you and your ex-wife, Ruth, along with your daughter, were living next door to Mr. Durst and Kathie Durst in South Salem in January of 1982, is that correct?
That's right.
I want to show you what People's 52 that we're marking. I want you to tell me, should be up on the screen here, if you are able to see in this photograph, explain what it depicts.
This actually depicts a lakefront property. There are 2 houses that show here. The one on the left is the Durst residence, or was the Durst residence at that time. And the house all the way on the right that has 2 panels on the roof is my house, or was my house, actually is my house even today.
And the lake that we see, that's called which lake?
That's Lake Truesdale.
And is that T-R-O-U-S-D-A-L-E?
T-R-U-E-S-D-A-L-E, yes.
And Mr. Mayor, can you explain that lake? How deep is it?
I would say that lake is about 15 feet in its deepest areas, and then it gets shallow in different areas as well. But
how large of a lake is that, you know, compared to, you know, is it like a great lake? Is it just like a pretty small lake?
it's a small lake. It's approximately 88 to 90 acres.
And in the wintertime, particularly in January and February, does that lake freeze over?
It does.
And do you recall in February, late January, early February of 1982, specifically if you can remember January 31st, February 1st, was the lake frozen?
It was.
And in your experience, I want you to assume for a moment that an individual were going to try to dump something the size of a body in a lake, in that lake at that time. Would that have been possible?
It would have been extremely difficult to dump a body, and it would have just dumped on the surface.
So you would have to open up. Does the ice freeze, in your experience, does it freeze fairly far down?
Back then, it did freeze quite a bit. Today, with the weather having changed, the lake is now freezing a little less thick, but back then it froze quite thick.
I want to ask you, at the time in January and February of 1982, were you aware if Bob Durst owned a sailboat?
He did.
And do you know what happened to that sailboat?
Actually, I do.
Can you tell us what happened to that boat?
Certainly. I told Bob that if he ever wanted to sell that sailboat, I'd be very interested in purchasing it.
And is that what happened at some point?
That's right. One
And-
day he said to me, you told me you were interested in buying my boat. And I said, that's true. And he said, are you still interested? I said, yes. And he said, I want $200 for it. And I gave him the money, and he told me to go get the boat. And I brought the boat over to my house, and I still use it. It's terrific.
I'm going to preface this. This is one of Mr. Bailey's expressions. This might be a dumb question, but I assume that the sailing at the lake in winter is not an activity that is possible.
For the most part, you're right. Unless you have a boat that goes, a ski boat, or that has like ice skates on it. If you have a boat like that that sails, yes. Otherwise, the kind of boat that I have, impossible, yeah.
I want to ask you, in terms of, your wife has described South Salem a little bit, but I want to ask you, can you tell me, how would you describe it in terms of its, back in 1982, its kind of socioeconomic position? In other words, the wealth of the people in that area.
It's an upscale community, kind of a bedroom community. A lot of the people commute to New York, work in New York City, and commute through the Katona railway station. So I would say it's a nice, upscale suburb of New York City.
And if I were to ask you, would you describe it, and specifically with respect to violent crime, as a high crime area, a medium crime area, an almost non-existent crime area?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. I don't think that...
What's your objection? State the ground.
Lay opinion, Your Honor, not based on fact.
He's lived there 40...
What's relevant?
That's another one.
It's absolutely, the relevance would be that it's the people's position that Mrs. Durst was killed out in Westchester, and that Mr. Durst did it. We want to make sure that...
Your Honor,
Well-
I mean, it's got to stop.
I was asked what the...
I asked for it. That's fine. Overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. How would you describe the level of violent crime back in 1982 in South Salem?
I would call it almost non-existent.
I want to ask you, did you ever personally experience or observe any evidence of Bob Durst having a temper?
The only time I experienced Bob being aggressive towards me while as a neighbor was when I was trimming the bushes that gave the two of us privacy, and the bushes ran between our two properties, and I was trimming them, and he told me to stop, and very forcibly told me to stop trimming those bushes.
At the time that happened, did it stand out to you in terms of the level of his...
Your Honor, I'm going to object as leading.
It's not
Just a
leading.
moment.
I haven't finished the question, Your Honor. So.
You did. So let me hear the question. I'll see if it's leading.
At the time, Mr. Mayor, did Bob Durst's response to what you had done, did it seem consistent with the level of the conduct you had had, or did it seem to be in any way somewhat overblown?
Your Honor, leading. What was his reaction?
Overruled. No, it doesn't suggest the answer. I don't know the answer. It's not obvious that it suggests the answer. Whether or not it calls for yes or no is not the point. The point is it doesn't unduly suggest the answer overruled. You may answer.
Okay, so it seemed to me that it was, for what I was doing, overly aggressive.
Did it surprise you in terms of your prior dealings with him? Was that something that you'd ever seen before?
No, because up until that point, I've always found Bob as a neighbor was kind of quiet and reasonably shy as a neighbor, and in this particular instance, he was neither shy or retiring at all.
Now, you said that Bob Durst was quiet over the number of years that you lived next door to him. Were you able to engage in normal conversation with him?
Absolutely,
And was he able to engage in normal conversation with you?
absolutely.
Now, I want to ask you, are you aware that Mr. Durst, in speaking to detectives in February of 1982, told them that he had had drinks with you on the night of January 31st when his wife disappeared? Are you aware that Mr. Durst made that statement to detectives?
Your Honor, I do object to that as leading. That does suggest the answer.
Well, preliminary matters also are appropriately led. So, overruled.
Just for the record, Your Honor, I also object to the relevance of this.
Sustained.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So
would you-
stop, sustained.
With the relevance, Your Honor, this is the...
Objection, relevance, Your
You-
Honor.
Right, I think
So try again.
Your Honor, this is the alibi which Mr. Durst
Okay, stop.
said when he was at
Okay.
the mayor's, which he later
Right,
said
right.
was untrue.
I guess he didn't hear you say stop, Your Honor.
Yeah, no, you didn't hear stop. All right, overruled.
You're aware, Mr. Mayor, that Bob Durst told the police back in 1982 that the night his wife disappeared, after he dropped her off at the train, that he came and had drinks with you. Is that correct? You're aware that he said that?
That is correct.
And can you tell me, is that true?
Not true at all.
And are you sure it's not true at all?
Absolutely, I'm absolutely sure.
And when, this is not the first time you've been asked about that, is that correct?
That's true.
In fact, you were asked by detectives back in February of 1982 from the New York Police Department, and you relayed that same information, is that right?
That's true.
And if I were to ask you, again, on a scale of 1 to 100, with 1 being I'm not sure at all, and 100 being I'm absolutely certain, how certain are you that Mr. Durst did not come over and have drinks with you on Sunday, January 31st?
100%.
Now, I also want to ask you, you're aware of your wife having reported seeing a blue light coming from the...
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for hearsay. He can ask you.
Its
Right,
foundation to a prior inconsistent statement under Evidence Code Section 1236.
It may be. Hold on.
So I have to ask the question to make the
Second.
foundation for exception.
Okay, just a moment. So you're proving, okay, sustained.
Your Honor,
You may,
I think I need to approach to explain to
okay,
the court.
let's have
Thank
a
you.
little evidence lesson.
Thank you.
So it says, we'll take a little sidebar. We'll step into the jury room. Go the other way, Mr. Lewis. Oh, the other way. We might be able to do it off the record. Hold on. I think we can do it off the record if you understand what I'm doing.
You're muted. You're unmuted.
Okay. Ready? Let's resume.
Your Honor, the objection then over, may I ask the question then?
Ask your question again.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Mayor, did your wife, Ruth Mayer, did she ever mention to you that she had seen a blue light coming from the Durst basement on the night of January 31st, as well as the next day, February 1st?
Yes, she did.
Can you tell me, to the best of your memory, when did she tell you that?
I would say she told me that almost immediately after she saw it.
Meaning back in February of 1982?
Correct.
And if I were to ask you again, how certain are you that your wife related to you that information back near February 82, what would your answer be?
I'm 100% sure she did.
I think I'm finished, Your Honor. Let me just look. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chesnoff.
Thank you, Your Honor. Morning, sir. Good morning still.
Hi.
Sir, it's been a long time since 1980, correct? Almost 40 years?
Agreed.
Okay. When did you first meet Bob?
I don't actually remember the date that I met him.
Sometime in the late 70s? Does that sound right?
I'm not absolutely certain of that,
Okay.
of exactly when.
Did you live there before Bob lived there?
Yes.
Okay, and when did you first come there?
Well, I've been there for about 40 some odd years already, so
Okay, so you would have met Bob after you were there and Bob moved in later. Is
that's
that fair?
correct. That's correct.
So sometime in the last 40 years you met him, correct?
That's right.
Okay. Now, you've spoken to the prosecution, correct? They interviewed you?
Yes.
You've spoken to policemen, correct? About these events?
A long time ago, yes.
Okay. Spoke to newspaper reporters about these events?
Yes.
Mr. Bagley from the New York Times?
Yes.
Spoken to television shows about these events?
Yes.
Spoken to the folks from the Jinx at length, correct?
Yes.
You even went in on multiple occasions and had interviews with them, did you not?
Yes.
And during those interviews, they would ask you questions, and then they'd stop and they'd re-ask the questions because they were sharing information with you so that you could formulate good dialogue for their film, correct?
Would you repeat,
Well,
rephrase that?
The producers were Smerling and Jarecki, correct?
That's right.
And they're not
Of the
police.
Jinx.
Sorry? I couldn't hear you.
Of the Jinx.
Yes. And they're not policemen, are they?
No.
And they were making an entertainment project for HBO, correct?
Well, I didn't know that at the time.
Okay, what did they tell you they were doing?
They were making some form of a documentary, but I didn't know what they were going to use it for.
Okay, and you would sit and talk to them, correct?
I did.
And they would share information with you, correct? Tell you things
Yes.
about their theories, correct? Of what happened?
Not really, no.
Okay, well, they would ask you questions, correct?
Yes.
And sometimes they would stop after they asked you a question and did what you might call a retake. Let's do this over again. Do you remember that?
Actually, we didn't do that.
Okay, at no time every time they asked you a question, you gave the answer and that was the end of it. Is that what you're telling us?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay, so when you talk to them, this is what year?
I'm not sure.
Okay, in the 80s?
Whenever the Jinx was being produced, that's the year that we're talking about.
But you don't have
I
an
don't happen to remember what year that was.
Okay, but you don't, so you don't have an exact memory, correct?
Mr. Chesnoff, do you want a stipulation on the date?
No?
No, you don't need to offer stipulation.
Thanks. You don't remember when it was, do you?
I don't remember the exact date now,
Okay.
sir.
Certainly was well after 1980, correct?
Yes,
Okay, so you will acknowledge that your memory of things, even in closer in time, isn't always accurate. Is that fair? Can't remember everything.
that's true.
Okay. Now, you spoke to them for hours. Is that fair?
Yes,
Spoke to Mr. Lewin and the police for hours. Is that fair?
yes,
Even spoke to them in preparation for testifying, didn't you?
yes,
They went over what they were going to ask you, correct?
yes,
And you gave them answers, correct?
yes.
And you worked on your testimony, correct?
The
What does that mean, worked
phrase
on?
worked, Your Honor, is argumentative and suggestive.
No, I think the answer may stand, he's asking to clarify what worked
Thank you.
on means, rejecting the.
He'd ask a question, you'd give an answer, and basically Mr. Lewin was outlining for you how your testimony would go, correct?
Yes,
So you've spoken to all these people over the years, many, many hours, correct?
yes,
You are aware that we asked to speak to you, meaning Mr. Durst's lawyers, correct?
I'm sorry, say again?
You are aware that Mr. Durst's lawyers asked to speak to you before you testified, correct?
Yes, that's true.
And you turned us down, correct?
That's also true.
Right, and that's kind of because you've taken a side.
Say again?
That's because you have kind of taken a side, correct?
I'm not sure what you mean by taking a side.
Well, you didn't want to assist Mr. Durst's lawyer in protecting his freedom, did you?
That wasn't the situation at all.
Well, we asked to talk to you, correct?
Wait a minute.
What, excuse
That
me?
is true. You asked to talk to me without telling me you were going to do it. I was in the middle of having dinner. I had 2% left on my battery in my phone. The place was packed with people and it was noisy. I had no knowledge that you were going to call or ask. And suddenly I get a phone call saying that you want to talk to me about the case at somewhere around 9 o'clock at night last night.
Okay, so
and
the-
I turned you down.
Okay, but it wasn't me who called you, was it?
No, it was
It was one of the prosecutors, right?
right, but
That's
what they said was
Yeah.
that you wanted to talk to me.
Correct. But
Okay.
I had imparted that to the prosecutor much earlier in time, correct?
I have no idea when you
Okay.
asked him.
Your Honor.
You want to stipulate to that?
Well, the stipulation is that if they want it, that Mr. Chesnoff, for the first time, asked yesterday
No, that's not
afternoon-
true, Your Honor.
All right, let's not get into that with this witness. He's got no.
Okay,
That's
so
not
the
about
bottom
this.
line is, your phone was dying. Did you ask to talk to me this morning?
What?
Did you ask to talk to me this morning? To take time to talk to me before you testified?
First off, I didn't even know that was an option.
Well, the question is, did you ask or offer to talk to me?
No,
Okay. So at no time in the 40 years since this event have you ever talked to anybody representing Mr. Durst? That's a true statement, isn't it?
that's a true statement.
Okay. Now, you would agree that your memory of these events would surely be better back in the early 80s than it would be today, correct?
100% true.
Sorry?
Yes,
Okay. Do you remember speaking to Detective Struck along with Senior Investigator Lowell and Investigator Stan Roman on February 9th, 1982 in Westchester County? Do you remember that? That would have been the first time you spoke to the police.
Would you be kind enough to tell me where that might have occurred?
At your home.
Yes,
Okay. And the 3 police officers came into your home, correct?
that's true.
Okay, and they came there because they were investigating where Kathie was, correct?
Yes,
Okay. And you welcome into your home, correct?
into the vestibule of my house, not
Okay.
into my home, but at the front door, yes.
And you wanted to help them in any way you could, didn't you?
Yes,
And your wife was with you, correct?
yes,
And they talked to both of you together, correct? They didn't separate you.
that's true.
Okay. And in the course of that interview, you told them that the Durst came up to their home and that sometime in the afternoon, Bob came over to the house and borrowed 2 hats. Do you remember that?
No,
Okay. Do you think it would help to refresh your recollection if you read the report?
I don't remember about the 2 hats.
Okay. Do you think it would help to help your memory if you had a chance to read it to see if it would refresh your recollection?
Okay, I'm
May I
happy to.
approach, Your Honor?
Yes, you may
Thank
approach.
you.
Give it a try.
Here you are.
So you can look that over without reading it out loud, and after you finish looking it over, tell us whether or not it refreshes your recollection as to that conversation.
Thank you, sir. Does that refresh your recollection about
I
the 2
still
hats?
I still do not recall the 2 hat part.
Okay. Do you recall that you both stated you did not see Kathie in person on that weekend, and that was the only time that you saw Bob? The mayors further stated that they went out on Sunday.
Compound question.
Okay, well,
Yeah, one at a time.
Okay, fine, thank you. You both told the police that you did not see Kathie in person on that weekend. You remember that?
Yes,
That's accurate, is it not?
yes,
You also told the police you went out on Sunday, January 31st, 1982, and when you returned home at about 21:30 hours, which is 9:30, they don't recall seeing the Durst car. You remember that?
At this moment, I don't remember that,
Did it?
whether I remember the Durst car at that moment.
Okay, again,
I saw that, and it's very possible that back then I do remember that,
Okay.
but at this moment, I have that problem.
thank you for that. You further stated that on February 3rd, at about 1900 hours to 2000 hours, you invited Bob over for a drink and that he declined, stating he had a cold. Remember that?
I didn't do that.
You don't remember that?
I don't remember inviting Bob over to the house for drinks.
Do you remember telling that to the police at the time?
Yes, I remember telling them that I did not invite Bob over to the house for drinks.
Okay, but this says that you told them that you did invite Bob over for a drink. So are you saying that your present memory is that this is inaccurate?
I don't know what you're holding there, whether it's accurate or not. I do not remember inviting Bob over for a drink.
Okay, so if the report states that he declined after you invited him over for a drink, so your testimony is today, 40 years later, that one, you don't remember saying it, or two, you never said it to the police?
I do not remember saying that I invited Bob over to the house for a drink.
Okay. Now, these policemen were doing their job, right, that came there that day?
I'm assuming so.
Right, you didn't know them previously, correct?
no,
It was a professional visit, correct?
yes,
It was to gain facts and gather facts, correct?
I guess so.
They had 3 policemen there, correct?
Okay,
Is that a yes?
Your Honor, the question lacks foundation.
You can answer, you don't remember, or you do remember
okay,
that
I do
false?
not remember how many policemen were there.
There was more than one, though, wasn't there?
I think that's true, but I don't remember whether there was 3,
And that's because today, 40 years later, your memory is not as good as it
as
would
it
have.
was back then.
Right.
That's fine.
So it's fair to say that on February 9th, 1982, your memory of what happened was more clear to you than it is today, correct?
Yes, that's, yeah.
Okay.
In some parts of this, I would say that's true.
And then you told the police on that day, did you not, that the Saturday after Christmas, you saw Bob, he came over and had a drink with you. You remember that?
No,
Okay. Again, your memory today is, 1, you don't remember that happening, correct?
I did,
And 2, you don't know whether or not
no,
you said
I
it at
didn't, I did not invite Bob over for a drink, is
Okay.
what I'm saying.
Right.
I remember that part.
So if it says that, it's inaccurate. Is that what you're saying?
Based on my recollection at this time, that is inaccurate.
Okay. Now, the train station is located where, please? In your neighborhood or in your
In
locale?
Katona,
Katona?
Katona,
That's in Westchester County?
that's true.
Okay, and that's a train that takes people to New York City?
Yes,
Penn Station or Grand Central?
Grand Central.
Okay, and this, you commented to Mr. Lewin that South Salem was a low crime place. Is that right?
Yes,
How many years have you lived in New York, Mr. Mayor?
in New York, meaning New York State,
The metropolitan area.
my whole life.
Okay, and would it be fair to say in the early 80s, New York City wasn't one of the safest places to walk around?
That's, it was,
It's vague, Your Honor, as to
Yes.
place.
Sustain.
Train stations in New York, by Grand Central, by Penn Station, 32nd Street, Grand Central, by 42nd Street, not the safest places in New York City, correct?
back then, I would say the Times Square was less safe than it is today, yes.
Back then, it was.
Back then,
Correct, thank you. What's the distance from your house to the train station?
between 15 and 20-minute drive.
So it's something that, if you're going to take somebody to the train, you get in your car and you drive to the train station, correct?
Yes,
Okay? And it's especially important to have a car to go to the train station in the winter because it can get pretty frosty and chilly by the lake. Is that fair?
I wouldn't know how to get to the train station unless you were going to walk or take a bicycle,
Okay.
and most people don't do that.
Okay. Now, you saw Bob sometime in early February. Do you remember that?
Yes,
And at that point in time, that wasn't different than the way you had always conducted yourself with Bob. You'd go to his house for drinks or a barbecue. He'd come to your house for drinks and a barbecue. It was quite a civil relationship, was it not?
we had a civil relationship, absolutely.
And the time that you mentioned that there was a little animosity over the bushes, that was an isolated incident in all the years that you knew Bob, correct?
Yes,
And it was about something that neighbors could fight about, which is whether the bushes are going to get trimmed or the bushes are going to stay full. Is that fair?
yes,
And the only thing that surprised you was that he was as upset as he was, correct?
yes,
But you also have previously told people that Bob did work in the garden a lot. Is that fair? In fact, you said that he inherited a house that was beautifully landscaped and he kept it up. Is that fair?
Would you rephrase that question?
Sure. Bob bought the house from somebody who had done a beautiful job in landscaping. Is that true?
Yes,
and Bob did his best to keep it up. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay. So Bob was concerned about the way his property looked, correct?
Yes.
It was well groomed, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Bob and Kathie would work outside together, wouldn't they, in the yard? Is that fair?
Well, sometimes.
Okay. And they were a nice couple, and you enjoyed socializing with them when you did. Is that fair?
Yes.
Do you remember what kind of car and the color of the car that Kathie drove?
The only car that I remember at this point was an old Mercedes-Benz.
Okay. And along those lines, you knew Bob came from extreme wealth, correct?
Yes.
But I believe you've said in the past he was very understated, not ostentatious, wore jeans, a polo shirt, and really was a pretty down-to-earth person. Is that fair?
Yes.
So he wasn't a show-off. He didn't let everybody in the world know actually how wealthy they really were, did he?
That's a true statement. In fact, he was, I would say, instead of being flamboyant, I would say he would be more penurious.
Okay? And in fact, you knew that at one point in time he had a health food store, and I guess he was kind of a hippie. Is that fair?
Up in Vermont, I believe, yes.
For 5 to 7 years after Kathie's disappearance, you continued to see Bob, didn't you? Like 82 to 88, in those years, Bob kept coming up, correct?
When you say continued to see him, what do you mean by that?
You'd see him at the South Salem house, correct?
Rarely.
But you saw him.
Yes, rarely.
Okay, do you remember he had a lady friend who had a child?
Yes.
Okay, and he would bring the lady friend and the child to the house?
To their house?
Yes.
Yes.
And that you and your wife were kind enough to allow the lady friend's child to use your kids' playthings because you had those things in your yard?
Yes.
Okay. And you didn't stop anybody from coming over in the years after Kathie's disappearance, did you?
When you say stop anybody from coming over, what do you mean?
His friend and his friend's child. You
Oh, they were welcome.
didn't- Okay.
In fact, I allowed them to come at will. So whenever she felt that the child needed to, use the play equipment that we had, jungle gym, she didn't have to even call or ask. She could just come whenever she wanted.
And so it's clear, this is after a period of time that Kathie has disappeared, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So you didn't shun Bob's friends. They were, as you said, they could come and go without any concern on your part, correct?
Well, I wouldn't say all his friends. I would say that particular friend.
Okay. Now, this sailboat, it's not like a sailing yacht, right?
It's a sunfish.
Right. The sunfish is the kind of thing that you learn how to sail on when you're at camp, with one sail and small area.
One
to-
sail and just a place for you to put your feet. Yeah, but it's a small boat.
Okay. And Bob gave you a very fair price to sell it to you, correct?
Very fair.
Right. He charged you, I think you said $250?
Something like that. I
Right.
think
And
it was
it was
200.
probably worth more than that, correct?
It was a, yes.
Okay. But you were his friend, you were his neighbor, you wanted the boat, and Bob gave it to you, correct?
Yes.
Bob also knew a lot about real estate, didn't he?
I assume so.
Okay. Well, you would talk to him about it, would you not? I remember reading, you're discussing, for example, the property across the street that Bob owned. You remember that?
Yes.
Okay. You never saw this blue light, did you?
I never saw it.
And as far as you're concerned, you have no idea what the significance of a blue light is, do you? Because you never saw it.
I did not see the blue light.
Do you remember?
But I must say, my ex-wife
Said she
saw it
Yeah,
and was very clear about seeing it.
okay. But other than her saying she saw a blue light, you didn't see it, and
No.
there was nothing exceptional about a blue light, other than your wife said she saw a blue light, right?
Well, it would be unusual to see a blue light, but the answer is, I didn't see it.
Well, if they make blue lights, somebody must use them, right? So it's not unusual. Is it?
I don't see blue lights that often, but okay.
Thank you. Now, Bob never asked you to fabricate any facts about the time frame involved in Kathie's disappearance, did he? Never asked you to lie for him? Correct?
So are you asking me if he's personally asked me to cover for him or lie for him?
That's what I'm asking you.
He did not.
Okay. In fact, I think you've been quoted as saying people suspect the husband, but you have to keep an open mind. Remember that?
That's irrelevant.
Uh,
Irrelevant, Your Honor?
No, I think credibility. You may answer.
I don't remember saying that.
Okay, do you feel that way? That you should keep an open mind?
I always think you should keep an open mind when, under circumstances.
Were you annoyed that the police didn't conduct a thorough forensic search of the house in a time frame close to the events? Were you upset about that?
The word upset, I'm not sure is correct. I would say that I was surprised to find that they did not.
Okay. And of course, you were surprised because you would hope they would go in to the house and conduct an investigation, and if they found nothing, none of us would be here, correct?
Well, I can't say what they would,
That's going to call for speculation. It's also argumentative.
Yeah, it's both. Okay, sustained.
Was that sustained?
Yeah, I mean, the
Okay.
second part. I don't know if we'd be here or not, but, you know.
I wouldn't be.
Okay.
I think we'd be here.
At some point in time, they did do some kind of a search, though, didn't they, that you yourself observed?
no.
You didn't know that they set up a tent or had police cars in the front yard and had police going in and out?
Of his house?
Yes. 20
Back
year-
then?
No, 20 years later.
Oh, 20 years later, yeah. 20 years later, they did all kinds of stuff. They went diving in the lake, and they sent dogs out sniffing the property. But not during the time that Kathie disappeared.
But you know that because of advances in science, you can gather information years after an event and collect evidence that might actually prove somebody did something,
It's
correct?
going to call for speculation. It also assumes several facts not in evidence.
Objection,
It's
speculation.
also irrelevant.
Just the two words, objection, speculation. Sustained.
Third word.
Right.
Thank you.
Magic.
Your Honor, does the court not want me to give multiple grounds, or?
You could say two, or you could say speculation, irrelevant.
All right.
That would be good.
What I'll do.
But I'm gonna go with speculation.
At least the police thought it was important enough, even though it was 20 years later, to have cadaver dogs, to go inside the...
You wait till the question's over. About objection.
Okay. It is still cross-examination. Sir,
Yes,
it appeared to you that the police were using an investigative tool such as cadaver dogs, correct?
yes.
Speculation outside the scope.
This is sustained. Cadaver dogs.
Do you want me to recall them, Your Honor? I mean,
That sounds like a speaking objection, which we're not supposed
Right,
to be doing.
neither of you.
okay. Sir, just so it's clear, the police had a further investigation done at the property 20 years later, correct?
Yes,
Now, at some point in time, Bob came and told you Kathie was missing. Do you remember that?
yes,
Okay? And in January of 2015, you were interviewed by Mr. Lewin, correct? You remember that?
January when?
2015, first time you actually heard from the West Coast law enforcement. Remember that?
I do remember speaking with,
And he
Mr.
asked
Lewin.
you, what was Bob's outward appearance and demeanor? You remember that?
yes,
Okay, and your response was, he seemed to,
This is
Yeah,
outside the
so-
scope.
Well, sustained. Have you asked him whether he presently,
Okay,
rather,
I'll-
before you go to the past statements, go to
That's fine, Your
presently?
Honor.
He may give you the answer you want.
You know,
Thank
it's
you.
also outside the scope, Cross, unless the people would have no objection, Your Honor, to the defense reopening with him, and then they can ask him questions in a non-leading fashion, but I didn't cover any of this area.
Okay, let me look.
Correct.
I'll ask the corrected question if you want, Your Honor.
Is this a different, do you need to reopen? Was
No,
this
I
covered
don't-
on direct?
No, I want to ask a cross-examination question. I will rephrase my question.
Rephrase your question.
Okay. Do you remember Bob coming over and talking to you about Kathie being missing?
yes,
Do you remember that he seemed genuinely concerned for her whereabouts and seemed worried? Remember that?
yes,
And at the time you were living next door, did you ever hear or see any actual arguing between Mr. and Mrs. Durst?
no,
And do you recall being at a dinner with Mrs. Durst? Well, let me do the time frame. Do you remember a day that she came over and she had been drinking?
This is outside.
yes,
This is outside.
Overruled.
And did she come into your house and have more drinks?
yes,
And then did you go to dinner with another couple and invited her along? Correct?
yes,
And at that dinner, do you remember that she had by herself 2 bottles of wine? Do you remember that?
no.
Do you remember that she drank a lot?
You did drink, yes.
Okay. And that was not uncommon for her to drink, correct?
I don't know about her commonality about her drinking.
But you saw her drink
That day, yes.
in excess, correct?
I would say yes.
Nothing further.
So this is new, but you may cross-examine on that because it's the nature of direct.
Mr. Mayor, you testified previously that you were aware that Mr. Durst gave an alibi to the police of being with you on January 31st, that it was not true, and Mr. Chesnoff has now asked you, did Mr. Durst come to you to tell you in advance, hey, I'm giving this alibi, et cetera, and you said that did not happen, is that right?
That's correct.
And when that occurred, did that strike you as strange?
You talking
Did
about
what
the meeting?
occurred? What occurred?
So when Mr. Durst says he was with you at the time to the police, and then doesn't come to you before or after and tell you, hey, listen, I told the police that I was with you, can you cover for me? Did that seem strange to you?
Well, wait a second. He never said to me that, can you cover for me?
Correct. So what I'm asking you is, you're now aware that Mr. Durst came forward and basically said, I was with Bill Mayer the night of the 31st. I went over and had drinks. You further said, Mr. Durst never in advance said, hey, listen, I'm going to tell the police I was with you, correct?
Yeah,
Did that seem strange to you?
absolutely. I mean,
What? He didn't let him.
I mean, I was thinking that he's using me as an alibi.
And in terms of why Mr. Durst would have given that alibi, you agree you have no idea, correct?
No idea.
Now, I want to ask you, Mr. Chesnoff has raised and brought up the issue of, quote, Kathie and Bob Durst being a, quote, nice and happy couple. Do you recall that those questions during his cross-examination?
A nice couple. I don't think he said the word happy.
Let me ask you something. Do you know, Mr. Mayor, excuse me, did you know at the time that right next door, that Bob Durst was physically and emotionally abusing his wife?
Objection, Your Honor.
What would the
Yeah.
objection be, Your Honor?
Assuming,
Wait, you don't ask, he says. Yes.
I am objecting, Your Honor, because it assumes facts that he's not privy to. He's presenting.
Okay, lacks foundation. Assuming facts he's not privy to lacks foundation. So you're questioning the basis for an opinion, but I don't think an opinion was rendered. So I think it's irrelevant.
Well, I'll rephrase. Did you have any idea that while Mr. Durst and Kathie Durst were living next door to you, that there was domestic violence going on in the house at the time? Did you know?
I did hear that.
Objection.
No, I'm not asking, I'm saying, did you yourself,
Move to
Mr.
strike.
Okay, stricken. Ask it again.
Mr. Chesnoff has asked you a question, if you're aware, did you hear any arguments, et cetera? Did you witness any physical abuse by Mr. Durst or Mrs. Durst? Do you recall those questions?
Yes,
You agree, you didn't know anything about it at the time, correct?
that's
Personally.
true.
As you sit here today, does it surprise you, Mr. Mayor, you said you've listened to the Jinx, you've watched and read articles on the case, you're aware that Mr. Durst has admitted to domestic violence at the time, correct?
Yes,
And does it surprise you then that this was going on right next door and you had no idea?
Objection, Your Honor. That calls for speculation.
Sustain.
On speculation, Your Honor?
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, you were asked specifically whether or not Bob Durst appeared genuinely concerned when he came over to tell you that his wife was missing. Do you recall Mr. Chesnoff asking you that?
I do.
And let me ask you something. Do you have any idea whether Bob Durst himself was actually genuinely concerned or whether he was feigning concern
Objection.
after he killed her?
I would have no idea whether he was acting or if it was genuine.
And you were asked specifically if you were afraid of Mr. Durst, in essence, by Mr. Chesnoff. Do you recall that cross-examination?
If I was personally afraid of him,
Let me rephrase the question, withdraw it. Mr. Chesnoff asked you numerous questions about the fact that you continued to see Mr. Durst after his wife disappeared, that he had come over and friends had come over, and he either asked or implied in his questions that you were not afraid of him, correct?
I was not afraid of him.
Your Honor,
Yeah.
what form of the question?
Avoid that form. The
Sure.
content is.
I'll ask another way.
No, I've allowed that to stand, just to try to avoid
All right.
phrasing it that way. I mean, simply eliciting the fact is all that you need.
So, Mr. Mayor, just so it's clear, were you afraid of Bob Durst after his wife disappeared?
No.
Personally?
I was not.
You weren't married to him, though, were you?
Objection, Your Honor.
I
Sustain.
was not.
Wait a
married to
wait
him,
a
no.
second, we might have a breakthrough here. What is?
Wait, what's your objection?
Absurdity.
That's a new one.
Is that-
I guess the evidence goes non-exclusive.
Is
I'm
that-
not gonna sustain that, but I'm gonna sustain it anyway. I mean, not absurdity, it's 352. You weren't married to her. It's argumentative.
I have no further questions.
All right, Mr. Chesnoff.
Yeah, just a couple. If Mr. Durst told the police he may have had drinks with you,
That misstates, that's
I-
improper hypothetical.
Okay. Phrase it consistent with the evidence that you expect.
would I expect?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, if
yeah.
he had mistakenly told the police that he asked to have drinks with you or had drinks with you, that would change the idea that it was an alibi, wouldn't it?
That assumes facts, not in evidence.
Sorry.
Your Honor, you asked
It's
me
an
what I
argument.
expect.
It's argument.
Well,
Sustain.
okay. The most important thing I want to ask you is this. At no time did the Bob Durst that you knew for many years ever ask you to provide an alibi for him, correct?
Correct.
Never asked you to tell the police anything but what you believe to be the truth, correct?
Correct.
And when you spoke to the police in your presence, did he ever tell your wife not to speak the truth?
I don't believe so.
Okay. Did you take any notes of your time spent with the police about what you told them?
No.
So the only people that were actually taking notes were the police themselves, correct?
If they were taking notes, then that's true.
Okay. Thank you.
Very briefly.
Yes?
Mr. Mayor, you were asked questions regarding whether or not you and your wife were interviewed together by the original detectives. Do you recall those questions on cross-examination by Mr. Chesnoff?
My wife and I were interviewed by,
Originally, in 1982, you and your wife were interviewed together, is that correct?
yes, he did ask me that question.
Let me ask you something. When you were interviewed by myself, Mr. Bailey, and investigators, were you and your wife separated?
Yes.
Meaning, did we interview you separately?
Yes,
And is it your understanding and belief that that conversation, that interview was recorded for anybody to listen to involved in the case?
I don't remember if it was recorded.
Finally, I want to ask you, in terms of the contact and the request for an interview, you were interviewed back in 2015, is that correct, by myself, Mr. Bailey, and investigators?
Yes,
Between November of 2016 and yesterday night, were you ever contacted by investigators or by the defense and asked to do an interview?
Be honest, go
No.
over the recross, Your Honor.
no,
So the first time that there was ever a request for you to be interviewed was yesterday afternoon or evening, is that correct?
Your Honor, if the
Yes.
district attorney didn't convey
Sorry.
our request
No, I don't want-
previously,
Your Honor, this is just,
Maybe we ought to have a stipulation about when and where you
we
you
can,
get to
Your
work
Honor.
on it.
well,
Mr.
this is-
Bailian will attest to the fact that for the last several days, I brought it to his attention.
Okay,
Yesterday.
all right.
Yesterday.
I don't
And
think
the
you
day
should be
before by
taking this,
email.
you're obviously using this witness to have some sort of proxy battle about when people were asked to, the point is, was he willing to cooperate with the defense or not? Is that something that the jury should consider in determining his credibility, whether he'd speak only to one side and not the other? And you're beating this,
well,
to-
Your Honor, I didn't bring the issue up.
Beating
Mr.
it down.
Chestnut brought it up.
Why would you bring it up?
Well,
Right.
now this is,
I'm gonna, I think I'll strike those answers and just stop this. I don't wanna hear any more about this.
I have one more question for you. Would the Kathie Durst that you knew, in your opinion, is there any way that she would have disappeared off the face of the earth in January of 1982 and never contacted her family and never been heard from again?
Your
No.
Honor,
Yeah, objection is,
speculation.
I think it lacks foundation for that.
Well, Your Honor-
Sustain. Sustain. Don't make every witness a basis for a new argument. Sustain.
All right, I have no further questions.
Thank you. Anything else?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
thank
All right,
you.
may this witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
You're excused. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think, let's take a little, maybe a short bathroom break, a real quick break, and then we'll see the rest of that video. I believe that's the end of our material for today. Is that right, Mr. Milius? You're excused, thank you. So ladies and gentlemen, during this 10-minute break, do not talk about the case or any of the people or any subject involved in it with anyone, including the other jurors. Don't make up your mind about the verdict or any issue until you've discussed it with the other jurors during deliberations.